So this is the first paper, the first study result that I want to look at here, and it's been largely led by the University of Cologne with a couple of partners, and the authors of this document are listed here. Now this is largely a quantitative study. That is, they've gathered quantitative results about the double materiality and ESRS reporting of a group they're calling early adopters. And there are 43 firms mentioned here who have already disclosed some kind of double materiality analysis, and 5 firms who have attempted a sustainability statement or a sustainability statement-like report. So the sample here is very small. It's worth noting that certainly 5 firms in the sustainability statement sample set, that is too small a sample set really to conduct any statistical analysis. However, we do gain a few insights from this paper. I'm going to scroll really quickly through just so you can see how quantitative this is. So it is largely questions or observations with raw counts of the results. I want to start and mostly focus on the top section here. This is the proportion of companies who reported certain topics as material. This is exactly as I would expect it to be across the marketplace, climate change being pretty much material for everybody. And that also aligns with the original intention of the standard and own workforce being material, and then with fairly high reporting for most of the other topics, with the pollution topic and affected communities being least reported. I suspect if we had more resource extraction heavy industry, then we'd see more affected communities being reported. Here's a table of some comparisons to what the authors are referring to as best practice. Now, I disagree with their interpretation of best practice to a degree, and I don't know where they're getting this from, except stating that best practice recommendations are based on the EFRAG implementation guidance and FAQs. Now, I think that is not a good interpretation of those documents, particularly here when we talk about representing the results of double materiality in a matrix and table. Now, I can understand using a table. I think a table makes more sense, and in fact, I think the suggestion from the authors here was that more use of tables could be done. But a matrix, I would definitely argue, is not best practice. The materiality matrix, as I've explained in other videos, was originally adopted by the GRI, and in 2021 the GRI themselves said that the matrix is no longer appropriate for a double materiality type analysis. So we have it from the people who invented matrix representations of double materiality that it is not appropriate. So I would argue that matrix is not best practice. There are far better examples of presenting the results of double materiality in non-matrix formats, and I would argue that they are best practice, not the use of a matrix. Anyway, that's a bit of a bugbear for me. That's one of my favorite topics to talk about. Overall, we see quite a high correlation with things like using AR16 for a long list of material matters, or potentially material matters. To be honest, I think that is the best way to go. Especially for early adoption, for first-time reporters, start with the long list, which was originally referred to as a top-down approach in early EFRAG guidance, and then match your IROs to that long list. There are other ways of doing it, the sort of more bottom-up methods, but I just think for the ease and early adoption, that makes the most sense. We also see very high proportions using integrated reporting. I think that number will get pretty close to 100%. Over the next couple of years. It makes a lot of sense to consolidate and to report the sustainability statement with the financial statements, even if the sustainability statements are being prepared on a voluntary basis. I'm not sure why 4 steps is best practice. This seems like the entire double materiality process is being shoehorned into a specific kind of approach, and that approach is being called best practice. I would argue that double materiality is a continuous process. In fact, the guidance tells us that it is a continuous process. So having a number of steps as best practice also seems to me to be a rather strange interpretation of the guidance. So I would certainly take this with a big grain of salt. I do not agree that this represents best practice. I'm going to skip through most of the quantitative parts of this document because you can read it yourself and you may get some interesting statistics out of it. But as I said, with such a small sample set, I don't really think that this is hugely valuable in terms of understanding the market. What I did enjoy, though, is this final page. These are the firms that are covered. And this is a really good resource. You can go to the websites of these firms. I checked the Ørsted one and I downloaded their first attempt at a sustainability statement. They are here identified as an early adopter in this document. And you can go onto their website and download that sustainability statement. Obviously, it's got some problems. There are some of their approaches I disagreed with, and some of the way they've represented their impacts, risks, and opportunities I thought were inconsistent, particularly inconsistent with their financial statements. And because their IROs and their financial statements are in the same document, it's now possible to see if the things that they are investing in and the things they are building and earning their money from are also the things that are generating their IROs. And you can see if there's some discrepancies there. And there's one very, very large outstanding discrepancy in the Ørsted report, but that's a topic for another day. So that covers this study, this document here. And now I'm going to move on to looking at the real meat of this video, and that is EFRAG's very recent publication of their similar study. Now it's time to move on to the biggie. This is going to take up most of this video, and this is EFRAG's very recently published implementation of ESRS, Initial Observed Practices from Selected Companies, July 2024. Now this is the state of play up until the end of Q2, or up until some point in Q2. So it's worth bearing in mind that there is at least one or two technical expert group publications which have come out since this study was done. So there are some of these practices in here which won't be the same now because additional guidance has been released. So a quick sort of caveat about this document. This is similar to the other study here, that this is based on surveys and interviews with reporting undertakings. And this is not supposed to indicate trends beyond that limited set of companies. So this is just a bit of a snapshot of some reported practices with a limited set of undertakings. We have some highlights, so some summary points right at the start of the document. I'm going to talk through a couple of these very quickly. The first couple of bullet points are stressing this distinction between a thorough, objective, science-based, data-driven approach versus what they're calling a qualitative or judgmental approach. At first, it's a little difficult to understand what they mean by that. That is clarified further in the paper, so we'll come to that when we scroll down later in the document. The next point that's covered here is a summary of how data points are being used, not used, filtered, reported, not reported, scoped, that sort of topic. There seems to be an embedded assumption in this first bullet point that a gap analysis is occurring or needs to occur. So we're going to just look into that assumption a little bit further. And then there's also this point here that the IG3 data points paper was being used a lot for gap analysis. Now, I have a fairly strong opinion on that. I don't think IG3 is the best document to use. And we have a newer document since this study came out, which in my opinion is a far more appropriate document to use to set the relevance rather of your reporting information. The scope is set by the materiality analysis. The scope is clear. It is the material topics. And the relevant information you should report, or the relevant disclosure requirements and their data points, I think it's far better to use ID 177 for that purpose and Appendix C of ESRS 1. But we'll come to that as we go through. We have some mention of difficulties associated with the value chain. Possibly some of this is going to be related to people over-defining or overcooking their value chain. I think with a quite tight definition of the value chain that this can largely be avoided. And it's interesting to note yet that there are efforts to go beyond Tier 1 for the next reporting cycles. That assumes that largely up until Tier 1 is the current state of play for many reporters, and to be honest, I think that makes perfect sense in the first reporting year to define your value chain up until the Tier 1 boundary and at least get your first report with Tier 1 supply chain included, and then consider where it's appropriate to expand that definition out in future reporting years. So I think there's a reasonable consensus around that in the market. We move on then to some reporting organizational approaches. It's not entirely clear to me what they're referring to here. We'll come to that later, but it seems to be about how they are allocating the effort or the resourcing of the materiality and reporting process within the organization. I'm pretty sure this is not a reference to the consolidation model or the reporting of sustainability and financial information together or independently of each other. Here is where EFRAG have gone into a little bit of detail explaining what they mean by the difference between an objective evidence-based materiality versus this judgment-based approach. I want to start with the judgment-based approach, and that is where they talk about the aggregation of views, typically gathered through investigations, surveys, and workshops, and not necessarily by targeting engagements according to expertise. We're going to come back to that in a second, but as a very sort of top-level overview, what this seems to be, in my opinion, is sending out very generic requests for information to non-expert people, whether those are internal people or whether those are potential stakeholders, and then aggregating all of that in a non-specific way. So let's give an example. Sending out a list of all the ESRS topics and asking people to just rank them. And then you receive all of those topics back from lots of different people, and they've all been given a score, 1 to 5, high, medium, low, something like this. And then you just take all those scores and you average them, or you find the median or something, and that is your score for that topic. And then you just draw a line somewhere, and that's your assessment. That is what I think EFRAG are getting at with this judgment-based understanding. Now, they are juxtaposing that with an objective evidence-based approach. And I get the very strong impression from this document that the evidence-based approach is considered to be best practice or far superior to this judgment-based approach. So now we can talk about what I think the objective or evidence-based approach is. And here is what they are claiming in this paragraph. It is using reference to internal data, that is risk data, thresholds supplied by risk management, internal projections, and strategy department information. Then the use of third-party data, such as topic-specific databases or in-house research on scientific papers. I can give you an example of what this would look like. Let's say this is a water quality impact. In order to understand a water quality impact, I would expect the specific change in the water quality to be understood, the specific receiving environment to be understood, which water body, which water is affected, what the baseline of that water environment would be naturally, and then what the natural carrying capacity or what the natural expected threshold of that water body is. In order to understand all of those things, this would require measurements, what is being emitted into the water, measurements of a baseline, measurements of the change, and then reference to some standard or some appropriate water quality threshold, which is normal. So if it is a bathing water, reference to what the European expectations for bathing water quality are. If it is a source of drinking water, then reference to what the drinking water standard would be, or reference to the European Water Framework Directive. So that is how I would try to understand an impact on an objective evidence base. And I would be using data points, scientific studies, these kinds of things to understand the characteristics of that impact. Now, the characteristics are the scale, the scope, the likelihood, irremediability. How remediable is an impact? This would typically require an actual understanding of the impact and potentially what is required to remediate this impact. Is it a construction program? Is it something I can do chemically? Is it simply a matter of time because the natural environment will restore itself under certain conditions? But all of those things have to be understood. They have to be studied. So that is what I think EFRAG is getting at here, in this difference between a judgment-based approach where you're basically just asking people or making guesses about what is important and what is not, and applying some kind of normalization or some valuation or some aggregation of all of that, versus when you're specifically looking to understand your impacts, your risks, and your opportunities, to measure them as far as possible, to compare them to other in-house data sources and risk projections. I think that is fairly clear, and I would only caveat this with one further statement, and that is most double materiality assessments, at least to begin with, are going to be a combination of both. There will be some examples of impacts, risks, and opportunities where it is fairly easy, or at least fairly straightforward conceptually, to have objective measurement of those things, to have objective thresholds. And there are some where it will be quite difficult, and we will need to wait for best practice to develop. So I wouldn't be too concerned about an approach that requires both, that requires some objective-based assessment and some judgment-based. What I would be very wary of is a double materiality methodology which forces judgment-based aggregation across all topics and all IROs. If your methodology, or if the provider of your methodology is doing this kind of aggregation, then I would think very seriously about changing provider, changing methodology. Really interesting to note on the same topic here that judgment, when it's based primarily on the input of stakeholders and internal contributors, can result in this divergent views, leading to a subjective assessment not anchored in data. Now that's a really interesting point to make, because I've seen a lot of entities pushing the responsibility for their assessment to their stakeholders, trying to use stakeholder data to understand what the IROs are from the beginning. And when you have stakeholders who are hugely diverse, non-expert, you start getting all these divergent views back, and it's almost impossible then to aggregate them. You have to exercise so much judgment if those are core parts of the assessment process. There are obvious solutions to all of that, which I've talked about in other videos. It doesn't need to be a trap that you fall into. Here's another really good summary of the kind of use of the views of different people, internal and stakeholder, and this almost maps perfectly to the approach that Code Gaia has adopted. Internal experts are used from the beginning of the process, prioritizing content owners at group level, getting your sustainability team, the risk and finance team, the procurement, HR, business unit function, getting those involved in the DMA process through workshops and interviews, and then engaging the stakeholders through a targeted approach. Finding out who your stakeholders might be, finding out what your impacts might be, and then validating and confirming and fleshing out your understanding of severity through the stakeholders. And then it says here, a mix of engagement channels allows undertakings not only to rank the importance of a topic, but to contextualize or delve more deeply into the issues. So I'm not a huge fan of the idea of ranking the importance of a topic, because the double materiality analysis is supposed to tell you what is material and what is not. I think that would make more sense if they got rid of this phrase, rank the importance of a topic, and change that to determine which topics are material. So now we come to the question of this data point gap analysis. So what EFRAG are referring to here, which it wasn't clear at the start of the document, is this concept, is assessing the gap between pre-existing reporting practices and updated ESRS requirements. So now it starts making a lot more sense. For companies who have previously conducted sustainability reporting, particularly if it was GRI, to be able to look through the data points and identify those parts of the company that are already delivering data that can be used also for the ESRS. Now this is a certain matter of efficiency. So this is why IG3 was created. IG3 was not created in order to scope the reporting on the basis of double materiality analysis. That is an entirely different kind of activity, which is why I would not recommend using IG3 for the purpose of determining relevance. Relevance is determined by the disclosure requirement itself and by your material IROs. So When we talk about gap analysis, this obviously only applies to those companies who were doing some kind of previous reporting. For all of the new reporting companies, all of the middle-sized European companies who have never conducted reporting before, gap analysis is not necessary because there is no baseline against which to conduct that analysis. It's worth noting that this integration of previous reporting topics into the ESRS was one of the highlight difficulties that the previous study also identified. And this is where companies need to be very careful because the materiality process under the ESRS is quite prescriptive and it will produce a different result in all likelihood from the topics that were previously reported. So conducting the gap analysis could be a waste of time if the double materiality analysis or the double materiality assessment ends up producing an entirely different set of topics or disclosure requirements that will be reported. So I wouldn't go too early with doing this gap analysis. I think conducting double materiality first is still the best way to go about this. Here's a couple of really interesting points. This is probably valuable for first-time reporting companies when they're asking who the heck do I get involved in this process? And here's a really nice statement. Typically, 5 or more departments are regularly engaged in the CSRD implementation process. Beyond the sustainability and finance departments, risk management, human resources, and auditing or internal controls are the most frequently involved. So this is a really good concept to be aware of if you're first-time reporting or if you're consulting to a company who's engaging ESRS for the first time, and they ask these questions early on. Who should be involved in this? And this guidance tells us typically these are the parts of organizations who are involved in this process. And so straight away, the reporting manager, the preparer, or the project lead can start engaging those departments early, give them an early heads up. By the way, this whole thing's kicking off. We may need your involvement, and who are the best people to be involved. That brings me to the conclusion of this paper. As I said, a bit more of a detailed run through. It's worth a read. Take note, however, that this is not supposed to be prescriptive or trend setting, the disclaimer from the beginning of the paper. But if you're looking to see what's happening in the adoption of ESRS reporting, this EFRAG paper is really, really worthwhile scanning, and it's written in a way that's quite comprehensible and understandable. Thanks very much for watching this video. If you've got any other emerging CSRD or ESRS topics you'd like me to cover, I'm really happy to delve into nerdy sustainability reporting topics. Just leave a comment below the video on the YouTube channel and I'll do my best to respond and see if any of those topics are worth me doing some research on and engaging in some further conversation.